And it says we're live. Welcome to another episode of Grad Chat from PhD Balance, where we talk about topics of grad school beyond the academic research and that may be more difficult to talk about in our day to day. I'm your host, Fay Lin, and I'm a PhD candidate in biochemistry at UCLA. If you like what you see here, check out the PhD Balance YouTube channel for more grad chats and don't forget to like and subscribe below. So, our topic today is effective teaching and learning environments, and I am so excited to talk to our guest, Graham Reed. Graham is a PhD candidate in radiation oncology at UCLA. In addition to research, he is the chair of the Graduate Programs in Biosciences Mental Health Committee, a member of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, and in regards to teaching experience, Graham is one of the TA coordinators for the Life Sciences Core and an undergraduate research mentor at the Undergraduate Research Center for the Sciences. In addition to all that, Graham currently has 4 undergrad mentees in his own lab. So I'm really excited because me and Graham were both at UCLA, and I had the pleasure of meeting Graham in person while working on the mental health committee at UCLA. And I can really speak to his passion and dedication to improving student life. So, welcome, Graham. It's great to have you.
Great to be here.
All right, so our topic today again is effective teaching and learning environments, and we have our guests pick what topic is the one that they want to share with us. So, why are you interested in talking about effective and teaching environments with us today?
I kind of come at this question from two different perspectives. I think there's an obvious human reason why we should care about making sure that the spaces where we learn and teach people are mentally healthy, that working in a mentally healthy better and more fun for the people learning. But I think it's also more effective. I think that people who are working in a space where they feel considered and valued tend to work more effectively and be more productive. So even if you're sort of a callous, non-empathetic person, you still have a reason to care about these things.
That is such an important take that I know in my work with mental health, it's really the framing that we're really trying to push in academia because it's a lot of this culture of if you do take time for yourself, then you're not a good student, where
Mhm.
we really need to have a healthier attitude of this is something that is gonna make me more productive if I take the time and really focus on student life. And I think that is one of the key missions in really changing the trajectory of academia.
And I think you touched on something else pretty important there too that I want to bring up. That when we're talking about teaching and mentoring relationships, we're always talking about this hierarchy between people. That creating these relationships always establishes this sense of doubt that the person says, am I justified in this relationship making space for myself? So when you're serving as a teacher or a mentor, I think it's very important to sort of proactively mention that that hierarchy doesn't mean that your student or your mentee shouldn't feel like they don't have that space. That the sort of belief that my mentor won't take my concerns seriously is very dangerous. And when you're occupying those spaces, it's important to be cognizant that feeling like you're open is not the same as your student feeling like you're open.
I think that's so important, keeping in mind themes of power dynamics and also how you may come across. Because, like you said, as a person in this mentor role or teaching role, you may have like the best intentions or be the most welcoming person, but you also have to be mindful of how you come across. And I think that's such an important theme as well. And I know you do a lot of work in not only teaching, but helping other grad students learn how to teach. So this is actually a good segue into one of the questions we have here, where it says, as a grad student, how do you get ready to do your teaching requirements when you haven't had extensive teaching experience beforehand?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. It's one that we come across all the time. And I think the honest answer is that your abilities as a TA are probably better than you think they are. And the nervousness that you won't perform well is just as or more dangerous than actually not performing well. And I think this is just an example of that same hierarchy kind of working in the opposite direction this time, where when you're standing in front of a classroom, your students will assume that you're the expert on the things you're talking about. And coming into that relationship with a combination of putting in the effort and having goodwill can be really powerful. Um, you know, even if you don't feel comfortable in your ability to speak in front of crowds or in your grasp of the material, simply being honest with your students when you know things and when you don't is super valuable. They know that you're a human being, they know that you have faults, they know that you have strengths, and admitting this isn't a topic I know super well, but I'll find the answer for you can be really powerful for a couple reasons. Number one, because it shows the students that you do have a human side. And number two, because it gives you an opportunity to not just present an answer to them, but to show them how you came across that answer. And that method is really powerful for teaching.
Awesome. I love what you're talking about in terms of this maybe self-empowerment or thinking about your own self-confidence, and also this idea that when you are this in this teaching role standing in front of the classroom, that inherently students are going to associate a sense of giving you confidence that you know you are in this more leadership role to them. So I think that's also a great thing to keep in mind, just like themes of self-confidence and empowering yourself as well. And it's naturally nerve-wracking, but keeping in mind that your students know you're human, and having working on self-confidence and just empowering yourself are great things
Yeah,
to keep
I
in
find
mind.
that students are much more tolerant of TAs making mistakes than TAs think the students will be. That if you make a mistake, acknowledging that you've done that and showing your students that you have like a good faith motivation that they actually learn things makes it so that they'll trust you when you make those mistakes.
Yeah. I think that's important too, like themes of authenticity
Mm-hmm.
and just being honest when you don't know things, because I think a lot of the nerves, I can speak for myself, like when I was a first year completing teaching requirements, feeling like there was a lot of pressure to know everything because these are students that look to me for guidance and teaching,
Mm-hmm.
and being this deer in headlights when I didn't know anything. But I think also recognizing that that's normal. Like we're also grad students learning. Sometimes it's this new class that we haven't seen before and it takes
Mm-hmm.
prep, but being honest and clear communication and vulnerable and showing students that you are human is a great way to go, and it helps their own learning,
Mm-hmm.
right? As you don't want to say things that you don't know and share false information, right?
But if you do that, then proactively correcting that false information can also be valuable. The students will remember that you put in the effort to make sure they learn things, not that you got it wrong the first time.
That's a great tip. I think that I also remember when I was going through teaching, we had like teaching training classes that I think you basically run those now, right, Graham?
Yes, I do. Well, there's professors associated with the course too, but I'm associated with the course.
Yeah, so you're a great person to talk about this, and it was such an important thing that resonated with me, was that there is opportunity to go back and say, hey, last class I said this thing wrong, but I want to go back, correct it. Maybe just again, it's authenticity and vulnerability that in my own relationships with the students that I was teaching, I think it really helped build a trustworthy relationship and one that
Mm-hmm.
was authentic.
Yeah, and I think depending on the level of your course, I've taught a lot of very research-based science courses, and I've always found that a fun thing that I love doing is turning the question around, and rather than saying what the answer is, thinking, how would we come across this answer? What methods and experiments can we try that will lead us towards that answer, and can we predict what the answer will be? Because this is a really good approach, not because it avoids answering a question you don't know, but because it shows students less the content of the knowledge and more the organization of the knowledge. There's this perception that you hear all the time, especially in biology, that this course has too much memorization in it and stuff like that. Now, it drives me absolutely insane, um, in the sense that um, knowing things is not the point of going to a class, but knowing how to know things is. You don't go to a class so you can memorize facts. You can Google those. You go so you can figure out how they interact with each other.
Yeah. And I think this also goes into what I've heard, this distinction between like lecturing and then maybe themes of mentorship, where instead of focusing on, hey, this is a list of facts, go memorize them, I'm going to show them on the slide, versus here's a question, how would you approach answering this question? I
Mm-hmm.
think is a big distinction that I hear when we're talking about teaching versus lecturing and all these other terms and different ways in which to be a mentor. And I think that's a great point to emphasize. Just part of your job is the actual material, but then also guiding students in what is the best way to solve problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, everybody has their own sort of internal universe that they use to process things. And if you just focus on memorizing facts or your organization of knowledge as the TA and you sort of hand that down to your students, it might not actually jive well with how that student organizes information. Plus, you're teaching to this classroom full of a ton of different individuals who all have different ways of processing things. So, even aside from the fact that it's way more work to just tell people answers, it's also not as effective. Getting students to figure out the process that you use to approach these answers lets them incorporate it into their own ways of thinking.
Right. Yeah, and you keep in mind that, like you said, you have a classroom full of students that may all think differently, and keeping in mind how to somewhat tailor individually to their specific needs is important. And I think it just goes back to this idea of being aware of if it's how you come off, but also being aware of these needs of specific students is another
Mm-hmm.
key skill when it comes to teaching and learning environments.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
sure. Sorry. Um, I think that a theme that we've sort of touched on the whole way through here is that a lot of these relationships are very predicated on this sort of trust between the student and the TA. And the only way that the students will believe when you present them with these sort of methods-based approaches that you're actually doing something on purpose, students will always just want to know what the answer is. So if you're taking them through, let's figure out how to get to the answer, students might get impatient from that or something along those lines. So them having a sort of trust in you is really important. And I think that building that sort of relationship where you've got more of a learning community is beneficial, both because it encourages that sort of trust and because it treats your students more like they're human beings.
Yeah, I know you mentioned that sometimes when you are doing whatever teaching approach, you might have the frustrated student. So, how do you deal with situations where there might be tension in the classroom, or students that do may get frustrated, which
Mm-hmm.
is a dynamic that teachers and mentors may may need to face?
Honestly, I think the best way to approach those students who kind of hit a block is to humanize the problem. That we all know that science is difficult, that if these fields were easy, we wouldn't need to spend this much time studying them. So, relating how you experience the information for the first time can be really powerful for your students. both because it provides them sort of an example of what you did when you hit this block, and because it shows the student that they're going through something normal, that I'm sure we've all, as we've gone through our studies, have found topics that came easily to us. We've all found topics that were difficult for us. And believing that our ability to understand a subject is fixed is extremely dangerous. So, your most important job when you run into these types of students who are super frustrated about their ability to process the information is to sort of put them in a mindset where they realize that the setback they're experiencing right now is temporary, that it's part of the process of understanding the material rather than some innate quality reflecting on them.
I love that. I felt like I channeled my inner student or back when I was I mean in undergrad I think is where you do a lot of coursework and going through that exact thought process that you were talking about just being like is this about me? Is this like something I'm able to do? Am I not good at it? And I think being recognized by the teacher at that time and just saying that this is normal can be really empowering.
Mhm.
And it's something that I wish more of my instructors did. More of like this humanizing, empathetic compassion, which I think is key to teaching, is what I'm hearing from these discussions so far. And I completely agree.
The
I
big caveat
think,
I'd like to add to this, though,
uh
is
huh.
that you need to make sure you're in an environment where the students will actually come to you with concerns, that they'll feel if I go to my teacher and say, I'm having trouble with this, I don't understand this subject, and I've been pushing up against that wall, that the student will believe that you're actually going to help them with that. Because it's super common for students to get in these situations where they're just spinning their wheels and they don't want to come to the teacher because they don't feel like the teacher will take them seriously or don't feel like they'll be helpful. So you have to be really proactive about creating these open environments, um, leading when you introduce yourself to your students, being very affirmative. Here are the values that I hold, and here's how I've interacted with the course material. Um, and doing those things to establish early on that these sort of blocks are normal and expected. Not putting the onus on the student to tell you that they have problems, but rather creating an environment where you acknowledge that these problems may come up and will be solvable.
Yeah, I love that. I I love this focus on environment in addition to the course material and the approaches to teaching. It's really a very multifaceted thing to create a healthy learning environment. So those were all such important points. Let's see. I do maybe want to shift gears a little bit because we have a couple of questions here that not only focus on how to support students, but how do you support yourself when you
Mhm.
are in a teaching position, especially when you're doing research and doing your teaching requirements. A question that we have here says, how do you balance your own mental health with that of your students? How can you make sure to keep a work life balance?
Yeah, I think that's a very poignant question. I think the easiest thing you can do to sort of safeguard your own mental health while still being a good resource for your students is to remember that the point is not that your student should expect you to fix all their problems, but that they should expect you to approach their problems with effort and goodwill. So if you have students who are coming up across things that push on your boundaries as a TA, I think it's perfectly justifiable to say, I personally can't go any further with my ability to help with this, but here are resources that can help you more. Um, so I encourage every TA to create kind of a red folder where you keep emergency resources that your students might need and to still project that sort of openness to your students. If you feel comfortable helping them directly and if the students feel comfortable being helped directly by you, then everything's fine. If not, it's perfectly justifiable and your students will accept it if you just move move it over to some other resource that you're aware of. As far as keeping work-life balance, I think this one is also a somewhat difficult question because students have different motivations than you do as the TA. You know, the student's interaction with you is predicated on you doing your job as a TA for them, and they sort of don't see all the other obligations that you have. But I've found that students are more accepting than TAs expect of TA's other obligations. That being very open with your students about, you know, sorry, I got this assignment back late. I was working on a grant. I was doing big experiments. TAs sort of implicitly know that graduate students juggle a lot of obligations, that this isn't the only thing that they're doing. And when you tell your students that, in my experiences, they've usually been much more understanding than I expected them to be.
Right. I think it comes back to this idea of communication where
Mm-hmm.
if you let them know that it's not because you're just ignoring them or not doing your job, and that clear communications of your other responsibilities, I think that helps build part of the trust and part of the transparency, and also challenges any assumptions that people are going to make when you don't have that communication and they think
Mm-hmm.
it's because of other reasons. So that's, I think it's very important. Communication is very important everywhere, but I think especially when you are in these teaching positions. And I also love how you mention being one, implementing your own boundaries if you do need to take a step back from supporting students, and two, being knowledgeable of the resources that are available. And you mentioned having like a folder ready. Are there any specific resources that are key for all teachers to have in that folder?
Yeah, I think the most pressing one that you'll run into the most often is a surprising number of students won't know about the Center for Accessible Education, a center where if they need accommodations on assignments or exams, that most universities have some center that will tell professors in a binding way to give those accommodations to their students. So that's always the first thing on my list because you'll run into students who feel guilty asking for these accommodations and they actually are able to get them in a binding way. Mental health resources on campus are extremely important too. Title IX and sexual assault resources, and anything else that you think is important. I personally also put economic wellness resources in mine. I run into a lot of students who have economic barriers to their learning, and I've had students come to me with those types of concerns, and I don't know how much those resources have actually helped them because they didn't share that information with me. But I hope they found it valuable that I at least presented them with those resources and told them that if they needed to talk to me more about it, that I would listen.
That's awesome. And that's also another good segue into this next question that we have here that says, when creating an inclusive slash mentally healthy environment, how do you make people feel that those efforts are genuine and not performative?
Yeah. Um, I think we've all sort of noticed that every institution talks about their longstanding commitments to diversity and inclusion these days, to the point where people hear it so often that I worry how often people believe it. And I think the easiest way to make that seem believable, at least from my perspective, is to be very proactive about it. That you don't just tell people that you care that they feel included, that you show people, here are my identities, here's how I interact with the world, and sort of the lens that I view things through. And I recognize that your lens may be different. Please come tell me about it as you're comfortable doing so. That rather than just saying that you respect people's identities in the classroom and think that they're an important part of the learning environment, you mention your own identity, you mention your own experiences with diversity or feeling included in the classroom as part of your first lesson. put it in your syllabus, mention it when you introduce yourself to your students the first time. And, I say this as a straight white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male with an Ivy League education. I tell my students that, I'm aware that those are all of my identities because even though I come from a very privileged background in that sense, it makes my students aware that I know that their experiences might have been different. And that if they come to me with how their experience has been different, that I won't assume that my worldview is the only one that's legitimate.
I love everything you just said.
I mean, to give an example of that, I mentioned that I'm chair of the mental health committee here. And I mentioned that to my students when I introduced myself to them as a TA. And the last time I did this, I taught about 80 students. And none of them actually came to me with mental health concerns. But I had 5 separate people mention that it was helpful for them that I mentioned my work on the mental health committee because it made them feel more welcome in the class in my course reviews. So I think a lot of these things will have impact that you don't see as a teacher, but your students will appreciate it anyway.
Yeah, I definitely, again, I'm like going back to when I was a student, and I think it is so powerful to have these topics, like you said, written on the syllabus or day one, just having a lot of transparency and directness and talking about them and acknowledging that mental health or diversity and inclusion or what my identity is and ideas of privilege, all of these types of discussions, I think just tackling them head on and making them clear, because oftentimes, and again, I think back to my own experiences in classrooms, they seem like things you just don't touch, like topics that you're afraid to talk about, and that ends up being harmful. Avoiding the topic and not having
Mm-hmm.
discussions about it was not helpful, because then it goes back to this idea of, well, if I want have a concern in any of these areas, I then don't feel comfortable talking to my tea about it, even though these are also such crucial components to a learning environment that we
Mm-hmm.
need to acknowledge. So I think that is super important, just having very explicit conversations about all of these topics that we mentioned, like put it on the syllabus, because these actions, being proactive, like you said, Graham, is so powerful. And even those so-called little steps of putting something on a syllabus can be impactful, just showing students that you care about this.
And I'm actually going to go a step further than that. Rather than just putting it on the syllabus and having this sort of top down, here's how we're going to approach diversity in the classroom approach, make it an interactive experience. Present to your students, here's a set of sort of class norms, how we're going to handle discussions in the classroom, and offer your students the opportunity to add or remove things from that list as they see fit. Because that presents to your students not just that you care about these things being taken seriously, but that you think that the students themselves have agency in this conversation. And speaking back to that hierarchy that can be really dangerous, making students feel like they'll be taken seriously, demonstrating that you think the students have agency over these conversations tamps down that hierarchy.
Yeah, I love it. Just making yourself available and having a space for students to be heard, I think, is powerful. And tackling those power dynamics and hierarchy is
Vulnerability
really
has
important.
power.
Mm-hmm. Love it. Love it. Awesome. All right, let's see. We have another one of these questions here that says, how can you stop yourself getting over invested in teaching slash TAing and putting your PhD aside? This person says, I love teaching, but I still have to do my PhD research.
Yeah, I super relate. So the way that I'm getting through that, at least as someone who definitely shares that concern, is a couple different ways. Number one, I sort of allow myself to be happy with how I'm doing one thing without recognizing that it's a trade-off. Saying that I'm doing well in teaching and I find this meaningful shouldn't come at the cost of feeling like you should have spent your time doing something else. You can feel happy that you've done a good job and made a meaningful impact teaching without feeling like you bought that time with time you should have spent doing research. They're independent things, and we shouldn't treat them like they're the same thing. Number two, I feel like these things do have value of their own that academia tends to gloss over. That people put this focus on research so much, and I'm not saying research isn't valuable. Obviously, I work a research position too. Um, but that teaching should be its own reward, and the workforce should recognize that. Um, I think that it's easy for graduate students to feel like their main job should be research. And I think that's a cultural problem rather than a physical one.
Right. Exactly. I think I totally agree that I don't think we value the non-research parts of grad school as much as the research parts.
Hmm.
And I think keeping in mind that the teaching that you're doing is one great, honestly, professional development. You're learning new skills, you're helping people, and challenging this notion that anything that's not research isn't as important. How, I guess a follow up to that is how do you balance keeping up with your research and doing TA requirements?
Yeah, I'll be the first to tell you that it is hard to keep things moving while you're TAing sometimes. Especially if you sort of spend a lot of time answering students' questions and are very proactive about that. The time can add up. However, I would sort of push back on the idea that a TA-ship is some obligation that eats up your time and more a thing of itself. That while you're doing teaching, you should be in an environment where you feel as though your research productivity is allowed to not be what it was before. That a TA-ship is, I don't want to use the word excuse, but while you're TAing, people should recognize that you only have so many hours in the day and that fewer of those hours will be spent in lab. As far as how to balance those, I do also think that if you do put a lot of weight on your research, it is acceptable as a TA, and we sort of touched on this before, to say, I don't have the time or space to process this right now, I have other obligations. And within reason, telling your students that that's the space you're working in is something that they'll usually accept.
Yeah, love it. Yeah, no, exactly. I think it's important to acknowledge that teaching does take up time, and there's only so
Mhm.
much time in a day where it makes sense that if you have additional responsibilities, it'll take away from research and having transparency and conversations about expectations related to how to balance that time.
Mhm.
Let's see. As we are wrapping up time for this grad chat, one of these last questions here says, have you ever got negative student feedback slash reviews and how did you deal with it?
Yeah, I think this is a question of mindset again, that negative reviews are a thing that happens, and it's easy to feel like I've gotten a negative review, I've done a disservice to my students, or they didn't like me. And this is sort of an intrinsic part of who you are as a teacher. And I'll remind you that back at the beginning of this, we talked about how that mindset is dangerous because it stops you from actually learning things. And the reason why students give you feedback is to give you feedback. So when you get negative reviews, take those in good faith. When your students tell you you should have done this more like this, consider number one, does this student know what they're talking about? Like, is this a reasonable concern that I feel like I should have done differently? And ask that question honestly. And once you take off the sort of self protective goggles that you're wearing, check, how can I actually fix this? The student brought up to me, I think this person should have done this more like this. how do you actually change that? And once you take those two steps, I think it's much easier to take negative feedback not as sort of an indictment you're a bad TA, but rather a way to make you a better TA.
That's an awesome mindset, which is so important. All right, we are wrapping up our time for this grad chat, but Graham, is there anything that we haven't discussed so far that you want to share with our audience?
Yeah,
Anything that comes to mind?
sure. I just want to reiterate that when we talk about these ways to make more accessible environments, that these aren't things you do so much as environments you create. That while this will require some activity and proactivity on your part, it's not an extra obligation, but rather a mindset that you're bringing into your teaching environment to make it better. So there's this common tendency when we're talking about mental health in mentoring relationships that accommodating for other people's space takes more work. And I don't think I agree with that. I think that it takes conscious efforts to make a space that you'll work in. And then once that space exists, it's an environment just like the one you're currently in.
Awesome. Woo. All right. So we are out of time for today's grad chat, but Graham, it was absolutely awesome to have you with us today. I think
Mm-hmm.
we touched upon so many important aspects of teaching in regards to how multifaceted it is to construct a learning environment, from communicating to just thinking about how you come off and individual student needs and all of that, that I think me as a beginning grad student, I would have loved to talk to seek advice about. So this has been awesome. So if you are tuning in for the first time or you've been a long-term listener, this has been Grad Chat, and we go live every Saturday, 12 p.m. Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. So if you like what you saw today, don't forget like and subscribe to get notifications, and we will see you next time. So thanks again for coming on, Graham.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Faye.
All right, see you all.